leave a like and subscribe.
He would willingly die for Ronnie. That was the one way he would like to go. But when could he see him? For more than a week, Dixon and Lenny made excuses. Then Mitchell seemed to understand that Ronnie would never come and stop talking about him. Two men were always with him. Donahue and the ex-boxer Billy Exley took turns with Dixon and Lenny. All they could do was try to make the time pass. 4 hours on end, they played cards with Mitchell. He was no card player, but they always let him win to keep his spirits up. He ate hugely, cleaned his teeth a dozen times a day, and constantly combed his hair, examining his looks in the mirror. He was inordinately vain. There was a day's excitement when the Times and Mirror published his letters, both of them in full. The Mirror included an appeal from its editor for Mitchell to give himself up. Then nothing happened. Reggie called in the next day, but he had no news. Only fresh promises that Frank would see his family for Christmas. Mitchell became restless. This was worse than prison. A few nights later, he threatened to go out and find himself a woman. He was beginning to groan in his sleep. Dixon told Reggie that if he didn't get a woman soon, there would be trouble. They brought a girl for Mitchell in a taxi at 2 a.m. With Reggie was Tommy Cowley, a little gambler with pale eyes and short red hair who always seemed a cut above most members of the firm. The girl was 30-ish. Cowley said they could count on her discretion. He and Reggie picked her up at Winston's Club in New Bond Street, where she was a hostess. In the taxi, they had informed her of her duties. Reggie said that if she did as she was told, she would have the gratitude of the East End. She replied that gratitude was all very well, she preferred cash. Reggie agreed. She had a lot of blonde hair and a good figure. Her name was Lisa. She was expensive. When she entered Lenny's flat in a long black dress and heavy makeup, Mitchell was all for having her at once. He appeared almost childish in his enthusiasm, but Lisa was no child. Since Reggie had gone on to Valence Road without paying the £100 she wanted, she told the Axeman he would have to wait. Mitchell could have forced her. Nobody would have stopped him. Most girls in her position would have done as they were told. But Lisa had her professional pride, and Mitchell wanted someone he could love, not rape. She kept her dignity and her black lace dress, and both of them sat in the kitchen drinking tea, while Scotch Jack Dixon drove round to Valence Road for her fee. Reggie grumbled but paid. 100 old notes in a carrier bag. Dixon gave them to her, less 20 for expenses. Reggie had promised that if she kept Frank happy, there would be more to come. And on this tender note, Lisa and her Axeman went to bed. They stayed there for the next 2 days, curtains drawn, the glow of the electric fire providing the only light, and Mitchell sometimes leaping out of bed for 50 press-ups. Mitchell was an enthusiastic lover. His virility was greater than that of any man I have known, the girl wrote later. But even sex was no real answer to the twins' dilemma. It was soon obvious to everyone that he would not remain cooped up in the flat much longer. He was becoming moodier. Only the girl could quieten him. On the 20th of December, he gave Lenny £5 and asked him to buy enough drink for a small party, as he was going to ask his family over before Christmas. The twins had promised he could see them. Lenny and Scotch Jack Dixon had been guarding Mitchell for 10 days now. Both were afraid that he would break out soon. Rather than this, they asked Lisa to try persuading him to give himself up. The first time she mentioned it, he said that he would do whatever the twins thought best. Next day she spoke about it, but the idea sent Mitchell into a rage, shouting about the 18 years he had spent inside and how he would kill anyone who tried to get him back. She tried calming him, but he went on shouting, and for a while, the others thought he would make a dash for it. "Give me your gun," he yelled at Exley, who was too frightened to argue. The gun calmed Mitchell. "I'll hang on to it," he said. "It's nice to know it's there in case I need it." Next day, the 22nd of December, Mitchell woke later and appeared cheerful. knowing he had a gun. Later his mood began to change. By afternoon he was weeping, shouting and saying he would go out and shoot the first policeman that he saw. When he was quieter he told Dixon that he wanted him to take a letter round to Reggie. It took an hour to write. In it, he said that unless the twins got him away at once he would get in touch with his parents. If anybody tried to stop him, he had a gun and would use it. Reggie was visibly annoyed at Mitchell's letter. Who does he think he is? He's got everything he wants, even a bloody woman, but he goes telling us what to do. Then he asked Dixon more about Exley's gun and Mitchell's threats to leave. This clearly worried him. Jack, go back to Mitchell and tell him he'll be all right. Tell him not to do anything silly and he'll be out of the flat in 48 hours. I think it's time I had a word with Ron. The twins and several members of the firm discussed what should be done with Mitchell that night at the flat in Finchley. Although Ronnie was cut off, he had been getting regular reports on Mitchell. He even knew about the gun, and according to one story, he had heard Mitchell was threatening to go round to Valence Road and use it on the Cray parents. Certainly, the Colonel's attitude to his old friend had changed dramatically. Suddenly he seemed to understand just what could happen if the police caught him. The twins and many of the firm would be involved. Mitchell could destroy them. That night, as the twins discussed what should be done, Frank Mitchell was no longer a friend but a threat. Next day, a further complication. Frank Mitchell was in love. Wherever they're taking me to in the country, Lisa must come as well. We'll never be apart again. Later the girl whispered to Dixon, he can think I'm going but I'm not. Just tell the twins I'll keep my mouth shut and that's that. Okay, she was told, but don't say anything to Frank. If he thinks you don't love him, he'd really do his nut. When Reggie came, Mitchell asked him about the girl. Of course he could take her. It was a lovely place the twins had ready for them, with animals and servants. Lisa and Frank could both be there together. Reggie gave Lenny Dunn money to buy Mitchell fresh clothes for the journey. His friends were calling for him the following evening. Mitchell was thrilled. To show how happy he was, he put his arms around the piano and lifted it right off the floor. Everybody laughed. Reggie looked relieved, shook hands all round and promised to be down to visit Frank and Lisa for Christmas. It must have seemed the most exciting Christmas Eve in Mitchell's life. For the first time in nearly 20 years, he would be spending Christmas Day in freedom and with the girl he loved. Reggie rang during the morning saying that Donahue would be calling around 8:30 p.m. and that Frank was to be packed and changed and ready to leave immediately. Dixon asked what was planned for the girl. Don't worry about her. Albert will see to her. Mitchell and the girl got up around midday. She cooked them all a late Christmas Eve lunch. Afterwards, everyone exchanged cards. In his, Mitchell wrote, "To Lisa, the only one I've ever loved," and she wrote back, "Darling Frank, may this Christmas be the best you ever had." They kissed, drank to the future and went to bed for the last time in the flat. At 7:30 p.m. the telephone rang twice and then stopped, the sign that Reggie was on the line wanting to talk to Mitchell. Was he packed? The friends would soon be round. Just before 8:30, Donahue arrived. A big grey man with thinning hair, he was one of the enigmas of the firm. He was a drinker and a fighter and an Irishman, but he never talked much, never gave himself away. The year before, Reggie had shot him in the foot during an argument in a pub off Valence Road. Since then they had made it up and Big Albert was regarded as Reggie's man, but he still limped. Mitchell trusted him because he had helped him escape. Donahue said Reggie's friends were outside with their van. The Axeman laughed and asked where they were taking him, and he was told, "We're taking you to a safe farm in Kent." "That means we're driving through the tunnel under the river," replied Mitchell. "You know your way around pretty well for a man who's done the time you have," said Donahue. "Got your things ready?" Mitchell had nothing much to carry and was anxious to be off. He shook hands with Dixon, then with Lenny Dunn, promising that Ronnie would be sending him £500 after Christmas for all his trouble. "Get your coat now," he said to the girl. "They're waiting for us." "I'm not coming yet, Frank." "That's right, Ronnie's orders. It's risky enough getting you there on your own. We don't want her involved, do we, if there's any trouble?" Cowley will bring her down in his car. She'll be there as soon as you." There was no time to argue. Mitchell nodded and kissed the girl goodbye. "See you at Ron's place then. Don't be long." At a sign from Donahue, Lenny turned the lights out. A few moments later, Mitchell stepped through the back door. There, in the Barking Road at 8:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1966, the story of Frank Mitchell, the Mad Axeman, officially ends. As far as the police know, there was no farm in Kent. All that is known is that 10 minutes or so after seeing Mitchell off the premises, Donahue returned and helped Scotch Jack Dixon and Lenny Dunn to clear the flat of all trace of him. The girl hung on to the prison comb and the Christmas card he gave her. Otherwise, his few belongings went: the beret and mask he wore during his escape, a pair of shoes, and a couple of paperbacks he had been reading. Every surface in the place was cleaned of fingerprints. Then a car driven by another member of the firm arrived for Donahue and the girl, and they ended up together at a Christmas Eve party in Evering Road. Reggie was there and took the girl aside. She was to forget all she had seen and heard during the last 5 days. She had never heard of a man called Frank Mitchell. If she mentioned him to a living soul, the twins would hear of it, and in the end, they'd deal with her, wherever she was. "I'll forget all right, and the sooner the better." She drank a lot, did her best to enjoy the party, and spent the night in bed with Donahue. After Christmas, she was back at Winston's, demure as ever in the same black lace dress. For her, as for everyone who came into Frank Mitchell's sad and violent life, he had ceased to exist. She kept the card that said she was the only woman he had ever loved, but those were the only words he ever wrote to her. None of his few friends nor his family ever heard from him. Lenny Dunn never received his £500. The months went by and the police continued their search. The twins had told the firm to answer any inquiries about Mitchell by saying he had gone abroad. There were reports that he was seen in Melbourne, in Casablanca, and the south of France. A postcard supposedly written by him was received from Tangier, but more persistent were the underworld rumors that Frank Mitchell was dead. If Frank Mitchell's grand escape did end in death, his remains were disposed of with some thoroughness. For 2 years later, when the Cray brothers and a South London gang leader called Frederick Foreman were accused at the Old Bailey of murdering him, the prosecution had to admit that they were alleging a murder without the evidence of a body. The case was long and complicated. The Crays admitted responsibility for helping Mitchell to escape and for harboring him, that was all. The absence of any trace of a corpse threw doubt on the prosecution, and Frederick Foreman and the Crays were finally acquitted. But it was during the evidence for the prosecution that the girl Lisa, Lenny Dunn, and Albert Donahue gave their own versions on oath of what happened during those 10 minutes after Frank Mitchell left the flat and how the story of the Axeman ended. Lenny Dunn and the girl both said they remained in the darkened flat, and their evidence was essentially the same. Both claimed to have heard loud bangs from the street outside, 2 or 3 minutes after Mitchell left. Lenny Dunn took them for a car backfiring, but the girl was hysterical and screamed out that they had shot him. Later, when Reggie Cray told her to keep her mouth shut, she did so because she knew the Crays and what they could do. But it was Donahue's evidence that created the greatest stir in court. In the first hearing at Old Street Magistrates Court, he had been in the dock, along with Foreman and the Crays, accused of murdering Mitchell. But by the time the case reached the Old Bailey, he had turned Queen's evidence. The murder charge against him had been dropped, and he went into the witness box to give his version of what happened between 8:30 and 8:45 p.m. that Christmas Eve. According to him, the Crays were desperate to get Mitchell away from Barking before he landed them all in trouble, and Reggie Cray and Donahue had a meeting with Foreman, an old friend of theirs, to arrange the move. Foreman had said he would lay on a van and a driver to take Mitchell down to the country. It would be waiting outside the flat at 8:30, and as Donahue was one of the few people Mitchell trusted, he was told to bring him out. To start with, said Donahue, everything went as expected. When he led Mitchell out of the flat, a dark painted Thames van was waiting, double parked, 20 yards or so down the main road. There were 3 men inside, including Foreman. One of them opened the back door and Donahue and Mitchell got in, Mitchell sitting on the wheel casing on the right-hand side of the van and Donahue going to the front beside the driver. Continuing his evidence, Donahue described how the doors slammed shut, the van drew away, and Foreman and the man beside him drew their guns, Foreman, a silenced automatic, and the other man a revolver. Mitchell made a dive towards the driver, but before he could reach him he had been shot several times in the body and collapsed groaning, with his knees doubled up under him. By now the van was traveling down Ladysmith Avenue, a turning off the main Barking Road, and 3 more shots were fired into Mitchell's chest in the area of the heart. For a moment, said Donahue, he lay still. Then he lifted his head. 2 final shots, claims Donahue, were then fired into his head and everything was over. This was Albert Donahue's story from the witness box of the Old Bailey. He said that he telephoned the news to Reggie from the flat, telling him briefly, "The geezer's gone," and according to another witness who was there, Reggie Cray wept when he heard the news. As for the disposal of the body, Donahue alleged that Foreman later told him they had to hold onto it for 5 days over Christmas, before taking it down to a man in the country for disposal. He also described how Foreman told him that they took the body to pieces, that the heart was ripped open and 3 bullets found in it, and that he had a tiny brain. He cupped his hands to show me just how small it was. Donahue believed the body had been burned. All this was strenuously denied by Foreman and by the Crays, and the judge ruled that under English law, Donahue's evidence required independent corroboration before the jury could accept it, as Donahue was himself criminally involved in Mitchell's escape. There was no corroboration. Frederick Foreman and the 3 Crays were found not guilty of the murder of Frank Mitchell, and to this day the Axeman is still officially on the run, one of the few men in history to have made a successful getaway from Dartmoor.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Cray's Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Cray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.